The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of golden dust beneath a burning sky. The sun was cruel that day, hanging heavy and unkind above the horizon. The wind carried only heat and silence, a silence so deep that it could make a person feel truly alone. Through that empty world walked a young Apache woman named Naya. Her steps were slow and heavy, her lips cracked from thirst. The ground beneath her bare feet burned, but she did not stop. She had been walking for hours, maybe days. She had lost all sense of time. Every shadow looked like a promise of water. Every rock shimmered like a mirage. Naya's mind drifted back to the morning when everything changed. Her people had been on the move, traveling to find a safer place after being caught between warring groups. They were tired but hopeful. Then, without warning, men had come from the hills. There had been shouting, chaos, fear. In the confusion, Naya had been struck by a falling horse and knocked unconscious. When she woke, there was no one left. Only the sand, the silence, and the remains of the camp. At first, she thought they would return for her. She waited for an entire day, calling out softly at every sound, every shift in the wind. But no one came. When night fell, the desert grew cold and cruel. The stars glimmered above her, and she realized she was truly alone. By the second day, her strength began to fade. The water she carried in a small skin bag was gone. She searched the dry riverbeds, hoping to find a drop left behind by a storm, but there was nothing. Only dust. Hunger gnawed at her, but thirst was worse. Her throat felt as if it were lined with fire. Still, Naya walked. The desert was not just empty. It was alive in ways that frightened her. She heard the hiss of snakes beneath rocks, the distant cry of coyotes, and the sound of her own heart beating too fast. The sun burned her back and her skin peeled in places. She wrapped part of her torn blanket around her shoulders for shade, but it gave little comfort. Her mind began to wander. She thought of her mother, who used to braid her hair by the river and sing to her in their old language. She remembered her father's stories, tales of warriors and spirits who lived in the wind. "The desert tests those who belong to it," he used to say. "If your heart is strong, the land will not take you." But Naya wondered if her heart was strong enough. By the fourth day, her steps had turned into stumbling. She no longer walked straight. Her eyes were glazed and the world blurred around her. She whispered to herself just to hear a voice. One more step, one more. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, her body growing weaker with each breath. The ground tilted suddenly beneath her, and she fell face first into the sand. It felt cool against her cheek, cool and comforting. She wanted to stay there, to rest her eyes just for a moment. She could almost hear her mother's voice calling her home. But somewhere deep inside her, a small spark refused to die. She forced herself to lift her head. Her vision swam, and she saw something strange in the distance. A dark shape moving slowly across the land. Maybe it was an animal, maybe just her imagination. Still, she tried to move toward it. She crawled for a while, dragging herself through the sand. Then her strength gave out completely. The sun dipped lower, painting the desert in colors of fire, red, orange, and gold. The light touched Naya's face, and for a moment she looked like part of the land itself. Fragile yet strong, lost yet still fighting. As the first stars appeared, the cold crept back. Naya shivered, curling into herself for warmth. She closed her eyes and whispered a short prayer to the Great Spirit, not asking for rescue but for peace. She did not know that fate was already moving toward her in the form of a man she had never met. Far away, miles across the sand and rock, Elias Carter was finishing his day's work on his ranch. The sky above his land stretched wide and endless. He was a man of few words, known in the nearby town as someone who minded his own business. His ranch sat at the edge of the wild, where the fences stopped and the desert began. Elias lived alone since his wife had passed years ago. The silence of the desert suited him, though sometimes at night it felt heavier than he could bear. His horses were his only company, and his days were spent fixing fences, herding cattle, and repairing whatever the desert wind tried to tear apart. That evening, as he poured feed into the trough, he noticed something unusual. High above, a few buzzards were circling him, slow and patient. Elias frowned. Buzzards meant death. Usually it was an animal that had wandered too far from the water hole. But something about the sight made him uneasy. He finished his chores and tried to ignore it, but the image stayed in his mind. The desert had a strange way of calling to him when something wasn't right. After a few moments, he whistled for his horse, Dusty. a tall chestnut gelding that had been his companion for years. "Come on, boy," Elias muttered, tightening the saddle. "Let's go see what's got them birds so interested." He rode out into the fading light, following the path that led away from the ranch. The air grew cooler as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The buzzards still circled in the distance, black dots against the orange sky. Elias guided Dusty toward them, his hat pulled low against the wind. It took nearly an hour to reach the area. By then, the light was almost gone and long shadows stretched across the sand. Elias scanned the ground carefully. Then he saw it, a shape lying still among the rocks. At first, he thought it was a dead animal. But as he rode closer, his heart gave a sudden jolt. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. He jumped down from his horse and ran the last few steps. The figure was small, a woman dressed in torn fabric and covered in dust. Her skin was dry and blistered from the sun. For a moment, Elias thought she was already gone. Then as he knelt beside her, he saw her chest rise weakly. She was alive. Barely. Elias took off his hat, his heart beating fast. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but something told him she had been through more than anyone should bear. He reached into his canteen and gently poured a few drops of water onto her cracked lips. She stirred faintly, a whisper escaping her throat, too soft to understand. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe now. Just hold on." The woman tried to open her eyes, but they fluttered closed again. Elias looked around. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. No shelter, no signs of anyone else. He knew if he left her there, she wouldn't make it through the night. He made his decision quickly. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, frighteningly so, and he could feel the heat from her skin. He carried her to his horse and mounted with her cradled against his chest. Dusty snorted softly as Elias turned him toward home. As they rode through the twilight, Elias glanced down at the woman's face. Even in her weakened state, there was something strong about her, a quiet courage. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew this much. Fate had placed her in his path for a reason. Behind them, the desert fell silent again, the buzzards fading into the dark. Ahead, a small ranch waited, and with it a new chapter neither of them could have imagined. The night was cool as Elias rode home with the unconscious woman in his arms. The stars above shone bright like scattered diamonds, and the desert wind brushed against his face. Dusty's hooves made soft thuds on the dry ground. Elias could feel the woman's faint breathing against his chest, uneven and weak. He urged the horse to go faster, whispering, "Hold on, just hold on." His ranch was still a few miles away, a lonely stretch of land with a small wooden house, a stable, and a water well. The lantern outside flickered faintly in the distance when he finally saw it. Relief filled his chest. He slowed the horse and dismounted carefully, holding the woman close as if she were made of glass. Inside, the house was warm but quiet. The old floor creaked under his boots as he laid her gently on the bed in the small guest room. The place was simple, a clean blanket, a single lamp, and the faint smell of wood smoke. Elias fetched a bowl of cool water and a clean cloth. He sat beside her, dipping the cloth and pressing it softly against her face and neck. The dust began to clear, revealing a young woman with deep brown skin and dark hair tangled with sand. She looked fragile, but there was a strength in her features, something that made Elias pause for a moment. He poured a little water into a cup and touched it to her lips. "Drink," he whispered. She didn't respond, so he tilted it slightly, letting a few drops run into her mouth. Slowly, her throat moved as she swallowed. Hours passed. Elias kept the lamp burning low and checked on her through the night. At one point, she began to shiver despite the heat outside. He covered her with an extra blanket and kept the fire in the hearth alive. He wasn't sure who she was, Apache most likely, and he knew helping her could bring trouble if anyone in town found out. But he didn't care. He had lived too long listening to silence. By morning, the desert outside was golden again, the sun climbing over the horizon. Elias stepped out to fetch water from the well, thinking about what to do next. He had no family nearby, no one to ask for help. But something inside told him that saving her life was the only right thing to do. When he returned to the room, he found her awake. She was sitting up slightly, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings. Her hands gripped the blanket tightly, and when Elias stepped inside, she shrank back in fear. "It's all right," he said softly. raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. I found you in the desert." Her dark eyes studied him cautiously. She looked around, noticing the water and the small bowl of herbs he had placed by the bed. Her lips moved as if trying to speak, but no words came out. "Water," Elias said gently, lifting the cup. He offered it to her, and after a long pause, she took it with trembling fingers. She drank slowly, the sound of her swallowing the only thing in the quiet room. "Good," he said almost to himself. "You're gonna be fine." He smiled faintly, but she did not return it. She looked tired, confused, and afraid. Elias understood that fear. He had seen it in wounded animals before, creatures that didn't know whether to trust the hand that saved them. So he kept his distance. "I'm Elias," he said after a while. "Elias Carter. I've got a ranch here not far from town." She didn't reply, but after a moment she touched her chest lightly and said, "Naya." Her voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Elias nodded. "All right, Naya," he said kindly. "You rest. I'll make something for you to eat." He went to the kitchen, which was small and old-fashioned. A stove, a table, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans and flour. He boiled water and made a thin soup with whatever he could find: potatoes, onions, and a little bit of salt. It wasn't much, but it was warm. When he brought the bowl back, she was watching him carefully. He handed her a spoon, but she was too weak to hold it steady. Without saying anything, Elias sat beside her and slowly lifted the spoon to her lips. She hesitated, then took the bite. As she ate, a small color returned to her face. She finished only half before shaking her head, exhausted. Elias took the bowl away and set it down. The day passed quietly. Naya slept most of the time, and Elias went about his chores, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and mending a broken gate. But his mind kept wandering back to the woman in the small room. Who was she? What had happened to her out there in the desert? That evening, as the sun dipped low, he returned to check on her again. She was awake, staring at the flame of the lamp beside her. The light flickered across her face, and for the first time she spoke more than one word. "Why?" she asked in a faint voice. Elias frowned slightly. "Why what?" "Why, help me." Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear. Elias sat down slowly, resting his hands on his knees. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because no one should die alone out there," he said quietly. "That's reason enough." Naya looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes softened a little, as if she was beginning to believe he truly meant it. Then she nodded slowly and lay back down. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his coffee, staring at the moonlit land stretching endlessly into darkness. The wind whispered across the sand, carrying with it the faint cry of coyotes. Somewhere out there, he thought, this woman had lost everything: her people, her home, her safety. And now somehow their paths had crossed. In the following days, Naya grew stronger. She still spoke very little, but Elias noticed her eyes followed everything carefully. When he worked outside, she sometimes stood by the window watching quietly. Once, when he came in from the fields covered in dust, she shyly handed him a damp cloth to wipe his face. It was a small gesture, but it made Elias smile. Slowly, a fragile peace settled between them. But not everyone in that part of Arizona believed in peace. The nearby town of Dry Creek was small but full of talkers, people who didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially native ones. Elias knew that if anyone found out he was sheltering an Apache woman, questions would come, maybe even trouble. So he kept quiet. He didn't go into town for supplies. He didn't invite visitors. One evening, as they shared a simple meal, Elias asked softly, "You got anyone looking for you?" Naya hesitated. Her eyes filled with something between sorrow and fear. "No," she said finally. "All gone." Elias didn't press her. He could see the pain behind her words. After dinner, she helped wash the dishes, her movements still slow but steady. Elias watched her from the doorway, thinking how strange fate was. Two people from completely different worlds. One once a soldier's son from Kentucky, the other a woman from a proud, ancient tribe, and now shared the same roof under the same wide desert sky. As night fell, Elias stepped outside again. The stars stretched endlessly above him, bright and cold. Somewhere inside the house, Naya hummed softly, a tune he didn't recognize, but it was gentle, almost like a lullaby. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. Elias looked toward the dark desert, remembering how he had found her lying still in the sand. Something told him that his life was about to change in ways he could never have expected. And inside the quiet house, Naya lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling, wondering who this kind stranger really was, and whether the desert had saved her or simply led her to another test. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet rhythm of the ranch began to change. The sound of wind through the dry grass, the creak of the barn door, and the distant call of birds were no longer the only things that filled the silence. There was now a softer sound, the light steps of Naya moving carefully through the small wooden house. Her strength had slowly returned. She still spoke little, but her eyes had life in them again. Elias noticed it each morning when he brought in firewood or fed the horses. She would be sitting by the window, watching the desert sunrise with a calm expression. Sometimes she helped with small chores, folding blankets, grinding corn, or sweeping the floor. She didn't need to be asked. She simply did it quietly and with care. Elias respected that about her. She didn't talk about her past, and he didn't ask. There was a kind of unspoken agreement between them, that silence could also mean peace. One morning, while he was mending a broken fence, he noticed Naya standing nearby, holding a small basket. "I bring this," she said shyly. Inside were wild herbs and roots. Elias recognized a few from the desert. "Where'd you find these?" he asked with a smile. She pointed toward the hills in the distance. "There," she said. "Good medicine. Help for pain." Elias nodded with quiet admiration. "Well, I'll be. You know more about this land than I ever will." That made her smile. A real one, small but full of warmth. It was the first time Elias had seen her smile since she'd arrived. For a moment, the silence between them felt different, not empty but full of understanding. As days passed, Naya began to spend more time outdoors. She helped feed the chickens, carried buckets of water from the well, and even learned to milk one of the cows. The work gave her strength and purpose. In the evenings, when the sky turned deep orange, she often sat by the corral and hummed songs from her childhood. The melody carried softly through the air, blending with the sound of the wind. Elias sometimes listened from a distance. He didn't understand the words, but the music touched something deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. It reminded him of peace, of the kind of quiet that didn't hurt. Still, not everything was easy. There were moments of mistrust that neither could hide. Once, when Elias reached out to hand her a tool, Naya flinched before catching herself. Elias pulled his hand back, pretending not to notice, but it stayed with him. He knew she had lived through something terrible. He just didn't know what. Another day, when he came back from town with supplies, Naya watched him unpack the sack and then asked carefully, "Town? Far?" "Not too far," Elias replied. "About 2 hours' ride." "Why?" She hesitated. "People there? They hate my kind?" Elias paused. He looked at her, seeing the quiet worry in her face. "Some might," he admitted softly. "But not everyone." Naya looked down at her hands. "I stay here," she said simply. Elias nodded. "That's fine. You're safe here." The words seemed to comfort her. From that day on, Naya never asked about town again. She preferred the company of the open land and the animals. The ranch, which had once felt like a lonely island for Elias, now felt alive. One afternoon, the wind carried a storm from the west. The sky turned gray and the air smelled like rain, a rare blessing in the desert. Elias and Naya worked together to bring the horses into the barn. Thunder rolled in the distance, and for a moment, lightning lit up the hills. "Stay close," Elias said, raising his voice over the wind. Naya followed him inside the barn, holding onto the door as it slammed shut behind them. The rain came suddenly, hitting the roof in heavy sheets. Dust turned to mud outside. Inside, the horses stomped nervously, and Naya reached out to calm one of them, whispering soft words in her native tongue. The animal relaxed under her gentle touch. Elias watched her, amazed. "You got away with them," he said. She glanced at him and smiled faintly. "Animals not lie," she said. "They feel heart." Elias nodded, thinking how true that was. The storm lasted all night, but when morning came, the desert looked new, fresh, alive, washed clean. Naya stood at the porch, breathing in the scent of wet earth. The sky was blue again, and sunlight glimmered off the puddles. Elias joined her, handing her a cup of warm coffee. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking it. "You're welcome," he replied, then looked out across the land. You know, this place can be cruel sometimes. But after a storm, it always gives something back. Naya nodded slowly. Like people, she said. After pain still can grow. Elias looked at her, surprised by her words. There was wisdom in her voice, simple but deep. He smiled softly. You're right about that. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a steady rhythm. Elias taught Naya how to mend fences, how to use a lasso, and how to ride a horse properly. At first, she was nervous, gripping the saddle tightly, but soon she learned to move with the rhythm of the horse. Her laughter echoed across the field one morning when she managed to ride without help. It was the first time Elias had heard her laugh. See? He said, smiling. You're a natural. Naya shook her head, still smiling. Horse kind. He teach me. That small moment of joy stayed with Elias the rest of the day, but not everyone was content to let them live in peace. One afternoon, while Elias was working near the barn, a rider approached. A man from town named Frank Dillard, known for his big mouth and small kindness. He dismounted and called out, Elias, haven't seen you in a while. Elias wiped his hands and walked over. Been busy, he said simply. Frank glanced toward the house and frowned. Heard rumors, he said slowly. Some folks say you got company out here. That true? Elias felt a coldness in his chest. You hear too much, he replied evenly. Frank smirked. Well, you know how people talk. They don't take kindly to... He paused, lowering his voice. Your kind of guest? Elias stared at him, his jaw tight. Whatever you heard, you keep it to yourself, he said firmly. Ain't anyone's business but mine. Frank raised his hands. Just looking out for you, Carter. Folks in town don't forgive easy. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off, dust rising behind him. Elias stood there for a long moment, staring after him. He knew what Frank meant. If word spread, there could be trouble. Real trouble. He walked back to the house slowly, trying to clear his thoughts. Inside, Naya was grinding corn at the table. She looked up and saw something in his face. Bad news? She asked quietly. Elias hesitated, then shook his head. Just talk. Nothing to worry about. But deep down, he knew it wasn't nothing. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the desert under the moonlight. Naya was asleep in the other room, her breathing soft and steady. Elias thought about how far she had come, from the edge of death to this quiet, fragile peace. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As he sat there, a thought came to him. Maybe fate had brought her there not just so he could save her, but so she could save him too. For years he had lived with emptiness, his heart buried under silence. Now for the first time he felt alive again. When morning came, he saddled his horse early. Before leaving, he looked back toward the house where Naya stood in the doorway watching him. You'll be all right? He asked. She nodded. Yes, you come back safe. Elias gave a small smile. Always do. He rode off toward town, the sun rising behind him. The road stretched long and lonely, but his heart was steady. Whatever the world might say, he knew what he had to protect. A woman who had survived the desert and somehow brought life back to his quiet world. And far behind him, Naya watched until he disappeared into the horizon, whispering a prayer to the wind for his safe return. The days grew longer, and the sun began to warm the desert more fiercely. Yet the ranch felt alive in ways it never had before. Naya had regained much of her strength, and with each passing day she began to move with more confidence, her steps surer, her eyes brighter. She had started to help more around the ranch, feeding the chickens, carrying water, and even assisting Elias with his chores. The quiet rhythm of work gave her a sense of purpose, something that had been absent in her life for far too long. At first, their communication was minimal. Naya spoke in short phrases, broken English, and Elias did his best to understand her. They relied on gestures, nods, and small actions to convey meaning. Sometimes it was frustrating, but somehow it worked. Even in silence, there was a growing connection between them. Elias watched her carefully, noticing little details. How her hands moved gently when tending animals. How her eyes lingered on the horizon as if searching for something she had lost. And how she often hummed soft, quiet songs that he had come to find comforting. One morning, Elias found Naya outside near the corral working with the horses. She had learned quickly and he marveled at her progress. She had a natural calm around the animals, moving slowly and deliberately, speaking to them in her gentle voice. When one horse became restless, she simply touched its neck and whispered, and the animal relaxed. Elias stood nearby, leaning on the fence, feeling a sense of wonder he hadn't felt in years. "You're doing well," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Naya glanced up at him and nodded. "Horse, listen." "Like you say." "Patience," she said. Elias smiled. "Yeah, patience. That's right." For a while they worked in quiet companionship, letting the land and the animals do most of the talking. But as days passed, they began to share more. Small stories, small jokes, small moments of life. One evening, while tending the chickens, Elias asked gently, "You remember your family?" Naya's hands froze for a moment as she held a chicken. Her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow, and she looked down at the ground. "Gone," she whispered. "All gone." Elias didn't push. He only nodded, placing a comforting hand briefly on her shoulder before returning to his work. Words weren't always necessary. He understood that she needed time, patience, and care, not questions or pressure. Over the next weeks, they continued to grow closer, though still cautiously. Elias would often find small gifts left by Naya, a handful of desert flowers, some herbs she had gathered, or a small stone she had smoothed and shaped. It was her way of saying thank you without words, and he treasured each one. One afternoon, as they worked together fixing a broken fence, Elias noticed Naya looking toward the distant mountains. "Thinking about going back?" he asked gently. Naya shook her head. "No, too far, too dangerous." Her eyes softened, though a shadow of sadness lingered. Elias nodded, understanding her unspoken fear. The desert had been cruel to her, and the world beyond the ranch was unpredictable. "You're welcome here," he said simply. "No one will hurt you here." She glanced at him, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time she seemed to truly believe it. A small smile tugged at her lips. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Elias prepared a small meal of bread, beans, and fresh milk. They ate together in silence, a comfortable silence that spoke more than words could. Afterward, Naya washed the dishes while Elias cleaned the kitchen. "Elias?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant. "Yes?" he replied, leaning against the counter. "Why, help me." Elias paused, considering how to answer. He had saved her because it was the right thing, because he could not leave a human being to die alone in the desert. But explaining that simple truth in words felt insufficient. "Because no one deserves to die alone," he said finally. "Because everyone deserves a chance." Naya's eyes lingered on him. She didn't speak for a long time, simply letting his words sink in. Then she nodded, as if the answer was enough. She had been through so much loss, so much fear, that this simple act of kindness was almost overwhelming. From that day, a new understanding formed between them, one of quiet trust. Naya began to follow Elias more willingly when he worked outdoors. She listened when he gave instructions and offered help without being asked. She even began to laugh occasionally, soft, low laughter that blended with the sound of the desert wind. One morning, Elias decided to teach her how to ride Dusty more confidently. At first she was nervous, gripping the saddle tightly. Elias walked beside her, holding the reins, giving her gentle instructions. "Lean with him. Don't fight him," he said softly. "He knows the way." Naya nodded, trusting him. Slowly she began to move with the rhythm of the horse. The fear that had haunted her since the desert began to fade, replaced by a sense of freedom. She laughed aloud when she managed to ride without his guidance, her voice ringing across the open land. Elias stood watching, a quiet smile on his face. "You see," he said, "you've got the hang of it. Horse." "Teacher," she said, smiling. Those small lessons became part of their daily routine. Elias taught her not only how to ride, but how to care for the animals, mend fences, and work the land. Naya, in turn, taught him patience in ways he had never known. He realized that her presence brought life back to his quiet world, not as a burden, but as a gift. But the world beyond the ranch remained unpredictable. One afternoon, while Elias was working near the barn, a rider approached, a man from the nearby town. He was known for gossip and judgment, and Elias knew trouble might follow. The man dismounted and called out, "Elias, heard you got some company out here. What's that all about?" Elias wiped his hands and walked over slowly, keeping his expression calm. "That's none of your business," he said firmly. The man frowned. "People talk, Elias. Not everyone in town approves of—" He glanced toward the house. "Of your guest." Elias's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. "I'll decide who stays here," he said simply. That's all you need to know." The man grumbled and left, but Elias felt the tension linger. He returned to the house and found Naya sitting quietly by the window, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up at him. "Bad?" she asked softly. "Just talk," Elias said. "Nothing to worry about." Her eyes, however, reflected the worry she had seen in him. Elias sat down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't let it bother you. You're safe here," he said. Over time, Naya began to open up more. She told small stories of her childhood, the songs her mother sang, the lessons her father taught her about the land and the animals, and the spirit of her people. Elias listened quietly, fascinated. Each story was a window into a world he had never known, a world that was beautiful and tragic all at once. In return, he shared small pieces of his own life. He spoke of his late wife, of the years of solitude he had endured, and of the small joys he found in the rhythm of the ranch. Through these exchanges, a fragile bond grew, one built not on words alone, but on understanding, respect, and shared experience. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Naya sat on the porch quietly humming a tune. Elias joined her, carrying a cup of warm milk. They sat together in silence, watching the desert come alive with the colors of dusk. "You teach me many things," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "And you teach me too," Elias replied. "You remind me there's more to life than just surviving." Naya looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. For the first time, she seemed truly at peace, not just with him but with herself. The desert, which had once been a place of fear and death, had become a place of healing. As night fell and the stars appeared, they remained on the porch together, sharing the comfort of quiet companionship. They did not need to speak to understand each other. Their trust was growing, slowly but steadily, and with it, a sense of hope that neither had felt in a long time. The desert, once harsh and unforgiving, had become a place of new beginnings. For Naya, it was a sanctuary where she could heal from the wounds of the past. For Elias, it was a reminder that kindness and courage could change lives, sometimes in ways one could never predict. And in the quiet of that desert night, with the stars overhead and the wind whispering through the grass, two lives from very different worlds began to grow together, learning, healing, and discovering the power of trust, compassion, and the simple truth that even the smallest acts of kindness could transform the hardest of hearts. The months passed quietly, almost peacefully, yet the desert had a way of reminding everyone that life was never entirely predictable. By now, Naya had become a part of the ranch in ways that went beyond work. She tended the animals, helped with chores, and even began to repair fences alongside Elias. Her movements were sure and steady, her presence calm and thoughtful. For Elias, the ranch no longer felt empty. Her laughter, soft and occasional, echoed across the land and warmed his heart in ways he had long forgotten. One morning, Elias stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Naya gather water for the animals. She moved with quiet confidence, bending to fill buckets at the well. He noticed how the sunlight caught her hair, and how her eyes reflected the clear desert sky. There was a sense of resilience in her, a reminder that life could recover even after unimaginable hardship. "You've grown strong," he said quietly. Walking beside her, she looked up, a small smile touching her lips.
"Desert teach me," she said softly.
"Make strong, if survive," Elias nodded. "Yes, and you have survived." They moved together through the ranch, completing the chores of the morning. Naya fed the chickens while Elias checked the fence lines. They worked in harmony, a silent rhythm born out of trust and understanding. Occasionally, Naya would glance at him, a question forming in her eyes. "Elias?" she asked. "Yes." He replied, "People. You worry?" Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. He paused, looking out toward the hills where the wind blew across the open land. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Some people don't understand kindness. They judge what they do not know." Naya thought for a moment, then nodded. "They not see heart." "Exactly," Elias said. "They cannot see what is in a person's heart." Life on the ranch continued this way for weeks. Naya and Elias had established a routine that brought stability to both their lives. She learned more about the land, about the animals, and about living in harmony with the desert. In turn, Elias learned to appreciate her quiet wisdom. The way she noticed the smallest details, the way she cared for the animals, the way she understood the rhythm of life on the ranch. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Elias handed Naya a small bundle of cloth. "Here," he said. "I thought you could use this for your hair or clothes." She took it carefully, examining it with her fingers. Her lips curved in a shy smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," Elias replied. "You earned it. You've worked hard." She looked down, almost bashful, and then glanced up at him. "Elias, thank you. For all. Life. Save." Elias felt a warmth in his chest that went beyond pride. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You were already strong. I just helped you along." Their bond continued to grow, quiet but unbreakable. They shared stories, meals, and small moments of life that stitched together the fabric of trust. Naya began to talk more, though still carefully. She spoke of her tribe, of her childhood, and of the lessons her parents had taught her. Elias listened without judgment, learning about a world he had never known, a world rich with history and wisdom. As the months went on, the ranch became a sanctuary not just for Naya, but for Elias as well. The quiet companionship they shared brought healing to wounds that had long been hidden. Both had experienced loss and hardship, yet together they found comfort, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Elias and Naya stood together at the edge of the pasture, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. The air was still, except for the gentle rustling of the grass and the soft calls of distant birds. "You stay?" Elias asked softly, looking at her. Naya nodded. "Yes, here, safe. With you," Elias smiled faintly. "You'll always be welcome here. No one can take that from you." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. Happy," she said simply. "Me too," Elias replied. Days later, word of her presence on the ranch reached the nearby town. Some people were curious, others skeptical. Elias knew there might be questions, even disapproval. Yet he was determined. He would not let anyone disturb the life they had built together. One afternoon, a neighbor approached asking about Naya. Elias stood firm. "She is part of this ranch. She is safe here. That is all you need to know," he said, his voice calm but resolute. The neighbor left, murmuring quietly, and Elias returned to the ranch, knowing he had protected something precious. Naya was watching from the porch, her hands folded in front of her. When he saw her, he smiled. "See?" he said. "Safe here." She nodded, a quiet gratitude in her eyes. "Yes, safe." The seasons changed and the desert revealed its beauty. Rain came and went, bringing life to the arid land. Flowers bloomed, animals thrived, and the ranch grew more abundant with each passing year. Naya and Elias worked side by side, planting, tending, and caring for the land. Life was not without its challenges, but the strength they had built together made them resilient. One afternoon, Naya approached Elias while he was repairing the fence. "Elias," she said softly, "thank for everything, life, new." Elias paused, looking at her. "You earned this, Naya. You fought. You survived. I only helped a little." She shook her head, her dark hair catching the sunlight. "No, you help much. You show heart, teach, trust. I learn." He smiled, feeling a sense of pride and peace. "Good," he said simply. Their days continued in this rhythm: work, shared meals, quiet conversation, and moments of laughter. They had learned to rely on each other, to trust one another, and to find joy in simple things. The bond they had formed was deeper than friendship, yet it was pure and honest, built on respect, care, and understanding. One evening, as the sun set and the desert turned shades of gold and violet, Elias and Naya stood together on the porch, looking out over the land they had nurtured. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of flowers and wet earth. Naya reached out, placing her hand gently on Elias's arm. "You stay with me?" she asked softly, a small smile on her face. "Always," he replied, feeling a quiet happiness he had never known. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and beautiful. It had been a place of fear, hardship, and struggle, but it had also become a place of healing, hope, and new beginnings. Naya, once abandoned and left to die, had found life again. Elias, once lonely and quiet, had found companionship and purpose. Together they had transformed the ranch into a sanctuary, a place where trust, kindness, and courage thrived. The animals, the land, and the quiet home reflected their care and devotion, but more importantly, they had transformed each other's lives. As night fell, the stars appeared bright and infinite above the desert. Naya and Elias stood side by side, hands brushing lightly, hearts quietly united. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. No matter what challenges might come, they knew they would face them together. The desert, which had once been a place of despair, had become a place of hope. Their story, of survival, trust, and human kindness, would remain as a quiet testament to the power of compassion. And in the stillness of the night, under the endless sky, two lives from very different worlds found not only safety but belonging, not only healing but joy, and not only friendship but a quiet, enduring love. The promise of tomorrow was simple yet profound. They would face it together, side by side as the sun rose over the desert once more.